Hey Pacers, Mr. Fox here. Um, Hope you guys all had a great winter break. Happy New Year. And I'm sorry to say, but we've got to get back to reality. I'm recording this on Sunday, January 2nd. School is back tomorrow. So yeah, back to reality, back to work. And so we had a bit of a issue at the end of last or right before winter break. By the way, if you're like me, I'm boycotting TikTok. I hope you guys are too. It's easy for me because I never did TikTok, so it's pretty easy to boycott, but it sounds like it's pretty terrible. So anyway, that aside, I really want to get you caught up on like what's going on in AP Human Geography and where we stand, depending on if you're A day or a B day. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the calendar real quick. Let's see. I want to make sure. Let's see. Let's look at the calendar. And I just want to make sure everybody knows kind of where we are. So this is tomorrow is the 3rd, January 3rd. And so that is a B day, what we used to call a white day. And so I thought in order to make things fair, just to not surprise anybody, and originally people who were on a B day, this is my 8th period class, is the only people I'm talking to right now, we're planning on just having the exam on January 3rd. Well, that's not going to work because of what happened on the Friday before winter break. So tomorrow, my 8th period class is going to have a exam review day. So we'll do that again. You'll also have a little bit of time to maybe work on some of the other things that in the booklet that you haven't worked on or you haven't finished. So just keep that in mind. And then on January 4th, and that's why I'm recording this video, is because my 1st and 2nd period classes on A days, I will not see you before the test, but just to be very, very clear, we will be having the test on Tuesday. So there's no exceptions. You've had tons of time to prepare, and that's what this video is for, is to help you prepare. And I'll explain the video, what I'm doing a little bit more in a second. And then of course, I'll have time to talk to my 8th period class, but you'll have the test on Wednesday, January 5th. And then of course, then we have a little less than 3 weeks to complete the political geography unit, but we'll talk a lot more about that next week. Okay, so what's the point of this video? So you guys have been off for about 2 weeks. Some of you, hopefully like me, have been just relaxing and trying not to think too much about school. But the only drawback with that is, you know, there might have been a little knowledge loss. So the purpose of this video is just to kind of review exactly what you need to prepare for the test. And because it's been so long, I am going to try to give you some hints and some to make it very clear what you need to do. Right before winter break, I did have a couple people actually take the test. They requested to take the test on that Friday. And the reports were it was a little harder than they expected. So we might have to grade this one on a curve or something. So don't stress out about it. But, it's 40 questions, multiple choice questions. And there are 2 FRQs you have to do. So that'll all be happening either Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, depending on what period you have me. So I'm going to go through, and basically I'm just going to kind of go through the booklet and just talk you through it. And the reason, this is a recorded video, so you can stop it, look at the booklet, say, okay, I've got this, I know what I'm doing here, or you can just watch it straight through. But feel free to stop it as we go along. So the first thing, as I look through the booklet, don't forget, also due tomorrow, or not tomorrow, if your 8th period, if you are 1st or 2nd periods due on Tuesday, if your 8th period's due on Wednesday, but of course, all booklet assignments that we've discussed will need to be done. Those are pretty straightforward, and I'll talk a little bit about those as we go through the booklet. The other thing to make sure, there's a few multiple choice questions about the countries that I'm asking you to memorize. So those countries are Eastern European countries, Central Asian countries, the stands, if you will, is usually how I refer to them, and the Caucasus, the mountain range in southwestern Russia, includes 3 countries, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So anyway, please study those. If we continue through, the next topic is folk and popular culture. So now I've taken some slides, and I'm trying to, if you're trying to plan for time, how long this is going to be, by the time you've opened this, you can see on the YouTube video counter how long this is. I'm shooting for this to be less than an hour, hopefully less than an hour, but I really have no idea how long this is going to take. So yeah, so I'm going to share some slides with you. Feel free to stop it, but I'm just going to go through the booklet, and this is not intended to be where you would take notes. That's already happened. So this is just review, and again, me giving you hints. And so you can kind of highlight things in the booklet to kind of say, okay, I definitely need to know that. Okay, so we're going to start talking about culture. So we will start with discussing the concepts of popular and folk culture. So again, I'm going through this really quickly. So culture, again, customary beliefs, material traits, and social forms of groups. So, you know, that definition is important, but more important is kind of the geography stuff related to culture. So folk, we're really, you'll definitely get some questions about comparing and contrasting folk culture and popular culture, okay? And so one of the things I talked about is how folk culture is really, is practiced by a small homogeneous group, so people who are very similar, and somewhat isolated areas, so that's maybe not that as important. But popular culture is large, heterogeneous populations that share certain traits despite differences. Okay, so folk culture is going to be practiced by small groups, traditional groups, and then popular culture's larger groups. And heterogeneous means lots of different people. So the way I think about it is, you know, pick a folk cultural trait, like some sort of eating practice, like food taboos. That might be true of a small group that practice that, and it's a particular type of group. But something, a popular culture food item or food culture idea might be fast food, where, you know, lots of different kinds of people eat fast food. Okay, so a couple other features. So we talked about the difference between pop and folk culture, and again, usually the traits are folk culture traits. We don't know who did them. They're so long ago that nobody even maybe knows. They don't really diffuse, except maybe slowly and through relocation diffusion, because, you know, when people move, they take their food, they take their, you know, religious traditions, they take their clothing, all those sorts of things with them. And then, of course, with popular culture, it's usually only traceable, it's often traceable to a person, or, you know, think pop star, think Taylor Swift, think, I don't know, some other person like that, or a corporation, think Coca-Cola, you know, I don't know. These things diffuse rapidly. They're often hierarchical because famous people might do them first, or they're from a big city like New York, Los Angeles, and then they diffuse down. And of course, they're diffused through modern communications like the internet, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so when I talk about this, and so definitely, as I mentioned, you need to be able to explain the difference between folk and popular culture. So some other things we talked about in terms of popular and folk culture. One is this process of assimilation. So assimilation, again, process of giving up your cultural traditions in favor of a dominant culture. Sometimes this is forced assimilation, and then sometimes this is voluntary. No, I didn't spell that right. Voluntary, meaning people choose to assimilate. They say, okay, I'm going to move to this new country. I'm not going to speak my language. I'm going to speak the language of my new country, or something like that. But more often it's been forced assimilation over the course of, especially United States history, Canadian, other places where Europeans particularly have colonized. So we see things like this. We see, you know, the forced assimilation of the Native American children in boarding schools. And again, here's another picture of a boarding school. Again, continue on this idea of challenges. So there's a big difference between assimilation, which is the giving up, excuse me. I'm out in my office, as I call it. So it's our office. It doesn't have heat, but I've got a little space heater, but I'm kind of cold. Anyway, acculturation is different. So acculturation is the adjustment to a dominant culture while retaining elements of folk culture. So this isn't giving up your culture. This is retaining elements. So the good example we gave, Muslims in France, right? So here's a woman wearing something called a burkini because she wants to maintain her modesty, being a Muslim woman, but she still wants to enjoy the, the pleasures of sunbathing at the beach like French people do. So this is acculturation. So kind of a blending of cultures or adapting your culture to another culture. Okay. Some other things that we talked about. We talked about a lot of things, but I'm just doing the highlights. So just be clear. And to be clear, just because it's not on this video, I want to be clear, it does not mean it is not necessary. It is not something that could be on the test. So it's not to say that you can just watch this video and assume that everything is fine. But I'm hitting the highlights because we only have a certain amount of time. So one of the other highlights I wanted to identify is this idea of uniform landscapes or placelessness. So when we say placelessness, this is the idea of this loss of unique place. And places tend to be unique around the world. That's why I think people travel. You see the skyline of Portland and it looks unique and it looks different than Seattle and Los Angeles and things like that. But there are certain places, especially I think of suburbia or some places like that, where it's kind of lost this idea of uniqueness and there's no unique place. So you could see this idea of like a strip mall, which could be in, Cleveland or Portland or Beaverton or anywhere. So anyway, that's this idea. And the reason it's a thing is because, again, we think of places as being unique, but when they lose that idea of uniqueness or placelessness, that's kind of important to geography. Okay. Okay, so by the way, in the unit for folk and popular culture, I went through all sorts of examples. Music, we talked about sports, we talked about clothing, food in particular, and I forgot to put it in here, maybe I should have, but I've already started. The idea of food taboos, okay? So food taboos would be an important difference between different cultural traditions, especially that's more of a folk cultural tradition, food taboos. So Muslims not eating pork, and Jews not eating pork, but other things as well. And of course, Jews eat what's called kosher food, and the similar idea is called halal for Islam. And of course, the Hindus don't eat beef, and those sorts of things. So that's one thing I might have put in here, but I forgot. Okay, let's just keep going. So some cultures deplete the resources, like I have here, the idea of Gulf, or folk cultures, depletion of resources by like doing things like using endangered animals in things like Chinese medicine. Okay, so let's jump ahead now and talk about language. So I'm flipping ahead and hopefully you're following along with me in the booklet. So there's one reading that was definitely, that is part of the, that is graded. It's about the burkini. And that is on page 14, so make sure you did that. There's also another article, Stemming the Tide of Popular Culture. That is an extra credit assignment if you want to do that. Then on page 18, you can see the language KBAT. And then, of course, there's the language reading, which starts on page 19 and goes into page 27. A couple things about the language reading. Don't forget to spend a little bit of time on the Celtic language language branch of the Indo-European language family, because that's really important and we did not discuss that in class, okay, the Celtic. So that's mostly on pages 26 and 27, okay? So now we're on page 28, and I just want to talk a little bit about language families and languages in general. First of all, one of the things, the definition of a language is basically a grouping of sounds that a group of people can all understand. That's kind of the definition of a language. So one of the things I asked you to do is on pages 30 and 31 in your textbook, learn about these language families, because we really didn't have enough time to really go over them in class. So of course, in the Americas, there's the major language family of the Americas is Indo-European. You can see here, that's what the beige is. Of course, in the United States and other countries in Latin America and up in other parts of North America, you have, of course, English dominates North America, but you also have French, and you have Spanish, you have Portuguese, and then Spanish down in the rest of Latin America. So those are the Indo-European languages of the Western Hemisphere. And of course, the other large language family that there's lots of language families, to be clear, in the Americas, but you can see this green is other, but they're very small, so your textbook didn't include them. But the one other one is Quechua or Quechuan, which is in the Andes Mountains, kind of left over from the Inca Empire. And so that's the only other big one in the Western Hemisphere. But if we move to the Eastern Hemisphere, and again, I asked you guys to make these maps on page 30 and 31. They are in your textbook. They're easy to find in the language chapter. But you can see, of course, the beige is once again Indo-European. And you guys need to make sure you have some general idea of what are some other language families here. I'm not going to, in the test, I'm not going to be too tricky, I don't think. But you do need to be aware of, where some of these language families are. So, of course, the second biggest language family over here is Sino-Tibetan. And then, of course, in Europe, of course, Europe is primarily Indo-European, but you also have this Uralic language of Finland and Estonia and Hungary. You have this big swath through the Central Asia and then into Turkey is called Altaic language family. Southern India is the Dravidian language family. So these are some of the major ones I just want to have you keep in mind. And then, of course, another major one is in here, North Africa and into the Middle East is, of course, this is called the Afro-Asiatic language family. I always remember that because it's Afro in Africa and Asiatic. So it spans both continents, Afro-Asiatic. And of course, the major language that is spoken here is Arabic. Okay, Arabic is spoken throughout North Africa and in the Middle East. And then, of course, it's very close relative down here in Israel is Hebrew. So those are a couple major ones. And then you've got some other language families in Africa. So that map is really important. Okay, and a little bit of details about each one. Okay, so yeah, so we already talked about this. I just put a bunch of slides in here. I'm kind of going through these for the first time, so hopefully it all makes sense. So then with Indo-European, because it's the language family English is in, you also need to know, and these are the maps that were on pages 32 and 33 and on to page 34, what are the different branches of the Indo-European language family and what countries have which branches? So of course, major ones, and I'll go through these in turn as well. You've got Indo-Iranian over here. So of course that includes Irani, the language of Iran. Persian is primarily the language spoken there. And then of course in northern India and in Pakistan and a little bit Tajikistan and Afghanistan, they all speak Indo-European languages. So Hindi in India is one, Urdu in Pakistan, and of course Farsi in Iran. Then you've got over here and down here, you've got Slavic or Balto-Slavic, depending on what textbook you use. Balto-Slavic in the east. You've got in the north, you've got Germanic. Of course, that includes English, German, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Dutch. And then, of course, in southern and western Europe, you've got Romance. Some people call it Italic. Those are the big ones, okay? So Germanic, Slavic, or Balto-Slavic, Romance or Italic, and then, of course, Indo-Iranian. Then you've got some smaller ones over here. Okay, so, and to go through those in turn, we can see we've got the whole idea of a language family is Indo-European, the language branch is Germanic, and then, of course, the language group for English is West Germanic, and then, of course, down here, modern English comes from Old Anglo-Frisian. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So make sure you know kind of what are here are the, of course, the branches, the major branches are, and again, this one says Italic, which is also Romance, also known as Romance. Those are the big ones. And then, of course, Greek and Celtic, you guys are reading about that on your own. Welsh and Scott. There's a few other ones that your textbook talks about, okay? All right, so let's move on. Here, of course, is the Romance languages. You need to know the big Romance languages. I'm not going to quiz you on Northern Italy because, even I don't know a lot of those, but the major ones, French, and we don't need to break it down into the dialects of French necessarily, but in Spain, of course, they also have another language called Catalan here in eastern Spain, Portuguese, and then Romanian kind of stuck out here on its own for historical reasons that we didn't go into. Okay, and of course, Italian. And one of the reasons that they speak all these languages in the Mediterranean is, of course, because of Vulgar Latin, which is spoken in the Roman Empire's provinces. That all came where these languages come from. Okay, then of course you've got Germanic. We've talked about a little bit about that. Another branch, important branch, English, and then here's Balto-Slavic. So Russian, Belarusian, Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, here in northern India, you've got the Indo-European languages families here, and then Dravidian down in the south. Okay, and then here's Europe. It's just shown another way. These are the different language branches of Indo-European again, and just kind of shows you where they speak the different branches. Of course, Greek down here, and Albanian are some other branches. I also talked about some of the branches, the non-Indo-European languages. So, you know, we talked about those being up here, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian. Of course, they're nothing like in English or any other Indo-European language. Then we talked about Basque down here being a isolated language, just kind of all by itself in between Spain and France. Okay. I gave you some examples here. Here's what Basque looks like, which is very different because it's a completely different language family. Okay. So we also talked a little bit about that. Now I'm on page 35 in the booklet. On page 35, again, those maps on page 32 to 33, and then on to page 34, you should be doing on your own. Proto-Indo-European. So how did they find out where is Indo-European believed to be? And so the first slide is actually the one, it's called the sedentary farmer theory or Renfro theory. And the idea was that, of course, here in what is today Turkey, they had these farmers who were there, and they were speaking a language that would be sort of like the language of Indo-European, or what they called Proto-Indo-European. And they slowly but surely built out or grew because of a growing population. And they spread out from there, kind of a more slow process into Europe, and then into what is today India and Iran, and up here into Russia. And so that's called the sedentary farmer theory. Or the other theory is the nomadic warrior theory. And it's also sometimes called the Kurgan theory, because there are these people, these warfaring people who were here in what is called, in southern Russia, and they were these mounted warriors, and they spread Indo-European throughout Europe and India, in Iran, through warfare and conquest. So we don't really know, but those are the two theories. Okay, so if we turn the page to page 36, a little bit about English. And we spent some time talking about this, like why does English have this very unique situation where we have Germanic words and we have Latin-based words or Romance language-based words, and where do they come from? Why do we have these synonyms, right? So the British Isles were originally Celtic. So the Celtic Empire, if you will, all these Celtic-speaking people were all over Europe before, you know, some of the different Germanic tribes kind of swept in. But anyway, they got pushed to the periphery, and eventually German speakers invaded, right? We've got these people called the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. And of course, that's where we get this concept of Anglo-Saxon culture here in England. And then, so they were there for a little while, starting around 400 AD, sorry, 450, if you will. And then about 1,000 years ago, the French came in. They invaded from Normandy. So these French-speaking people, or people who spoke a Latin-based language, they came in and they basically took over. And so the French speakers were the aristocracy. By the way, the Celtic languages were pushed to the periphery, into Ireland, into Wales, into Cornwall, into Scotland. But in England, this blending of these Latin-based languages like French and Germanic had this interesting thing. So the lower class people spoke German, and the upper crust spoke French. And so we have these synonyms, right? So the Germanic is the common language. So German, the peasantry had stools, which is the same as the German word Stuhl, whereas the upper crust, the French speakers had words like chair, which comes from the French. And same thing with lots of, and not to mention the animals, right? So cow is the name of the animal, comes from the Germanic, but the food, the beef, is a French word because the French speakers were the ones who actually ate the food. So it's similar: beef and cow, sheep and mutton, pig or swine is what the Germans call it, Schwein, and ham or jamon which is what ham is in Spanish. But anyway, so that's how that works. A couple other language terms. First of all, you need to know the term lingua franca, okay? Really important term. Will be in definitely in the AP test, definitely in the test you're going to have in a couple days. Lingua franca, language that facilitates communication of trade between people who speak different languages, okay? So lingua francas of today, again, our English is a big lingua franca to some degree, Arabic in the Muslim world, Hindi in South Asia, Russian, certainly in places where people used to speak, used to be part of the Soviet Union. Swahili is definitely lingua franca down in East Africa. So again, these are to overcome language barriers and make it so, and often in business is a big one, where people would speak a lingua franca, because, if two people don't speak the same language, well, then they need to have a language they can speak. So that's the idea of lingua franca. So we kind of went over some of those. The other thing is, I can't remember if it shows up in the test or not, but the idea of a pidgin language is a temporary language that is a blending of a lingua franca and some other native languages, which happens periodically. It's happened through history. Sometimes those are lost because they're not usually written down. They're temporary. And again, there's no native speakers. We'll talk about, of course, if there are if two languages blend, and especially if they're coming from a European language, that's often called a creolized language or a Creole. I can't remember if I have a slide for that, but the Creoles are passed on from generation to generation, but not a pidgin. So a little bit about dialects. First of all, a dialect is different than an accent. An accent is just a difference in pronunciation. But a dialect is when you have a regional variation, and this is really important and we went over this at length, in vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. So we're not going to go through all of it here. But of course, we've talked about American versus British in terms of vocabulary. American has some Indian words like raccoon and moccasins and things like that. It's because those things were here and not in Europe. But of course, there's also lots of different vocabulary. We talked about this. So, the Australians as well, but the British we say crosswalk, they say zebra crossing, we say diaper for a baby, they say nappy. We went over those. Have some of those in your back pocket. Know some of those differences. You're going to need to be able to explain this dialect difference between American and British. And we talked about spelling. So things like theater with the RE for the British instead of ER for American. So again, this was influenced by Noah Webster, who was the first person who said, let's write this down. So the added you in things like color or honor or labor, those are British. And of course, defense and defense. And then of course, pronunciation. And, you can watch that video again. The link is on the slideshows that I have posted on Google Classroom. But, we've talked about how the Americans drop some letters, especially a T sound, like the word cut and what. And we don't say internet, we say internet. Of course, the British, tend to drop R's in words like party and things like that. So go back, and those should all be in your notes. Sorry, I should be telling you what page we're on. That should all be in your notes on page 43. Okay. So let's move on. A little bit more about other American dialects, just to keep us all. So a couple ones I want to focus on: African American Vernacular English, at one time called Ebonics. So again, very much it was derided for a long time, but now certainly linguists and educators are coming around to the idea that it's just a different dialect, and needs to be celebrated. And of course, a lot of African-American students are taught both standard English and African-American dialect. We also have Appalachian English, which is very similar, could be, but of course in the Appalachian Mountains in the South, could be considered less educated, but again, just a different dialect. Creole languages, and again, here we go, down in down in Louisiana, we have French Creole, so a mixture of colonizers' languages and native languages. Okay. Then if we continue on, you can see on pages 46 to 47 and then 48, there are places, there's definitely going to be both in the FRQs and on the in the multiple choice places where you can talk about where language divides countries. Okay. And so I'm going to go through these really quick, but you should go back through them and make sure you know them pretty well. So first of all, Spain, Catalan was once considered a dialect. Now it's considered its own language. And so in Spain, of course, the majority of central Spain, they speak a language called Castilian. But in eastern Spain, they speak Catalan, and the Catalan people are, at this point, it's actually a political divide. The people of Catalan have actually tried to separate from Spain. A bunch of their politicians were arrested and put in jail because of it. But anyway, Catalan is a language of Spain that's been oppressed or suppressed for quite some time, but it's a big rallying cry for the Catalan people. But anyway, they also have other ones like Basque is not a dialect, or it's just a totally different language, as we've talked about. And then Asturian and Galician are both languages of Spain, very similar to Spanish, but their own languages nonetheless. Switzerland we talked about, where Switzerland is right here, where the Romance and the Germanic languages meet. And then, of course, there's 4 languages in Switzerland. You've got the German, centered on Zurich for the most part. You've got the French. Geneva is the French-speaking big city. Then, of course, down closer to Italy, you've got Italian and Romansh. Romansh is very few people speak it, but nonetheless an official language of Switzerland. And the thing about them is, and what we talked about, is the peaceful coexistence, because they have this extremely decentralized power. So they have these states or cantons where no one group really dominates. So it's been easier for them to get along. So that's Switzerland. Canada, of course, we know 1/4 of Canadians speak French, and this is only part of Eastern Canada, but centered around Montreal and Quebec City. Of course, the province in which people speak primarily French is Quebec in Eastern Canada. And you can see here, that's where they speak. So this is, Quebec is mandatory. They require French to be spoken mandatory. It's in street signs and menus. It's basically everything's in French. So French has been has been some of the more disadvantaged areas. And they've actually voted to separate from Canada a couple times. Neither time have those votes succeeded. So that's Quebec. Nigeria. Nigeria's got lots of languages. You can see Nigeria is here, and Nigeria has 3 language families in it. So that creates incredible amount of diversity in terms of linguistics. And they have 528 individual languages. They have a few that dominate. In the north, there's a language called Hausa, and Igbo and Yoruba are both in the south. And we can see here, Hausa is up here, Igbo over here, the purple, and then Yoruba. Of course, Yoruba is spoken around in Lagos, but Lagos is traditionally the capital. It is still the main city, and most people kind of consider the commercial capital of Nigeria. But as we talked about, in order to create more cohesiveness or more kind of so people didn't feel left out, they put the capital of Nigeria in the center of the country in a city called Abuja, so that nobody really feels dominated by one other group. And we've also talked about how this is impacted by religion, because of course these people up here are Muslims, and these people down here are Christians for the most part, and Abuja is kind of right in the middle. And so Nigeria is really trying to thread the balance of having lots of different people. Okay, So then Belgium, we know that Belgium in the north is called Flanders, and in the south is called Wallonia. And I can't talk about Belgium without thinking of Ned Flanders, but has nothing to do with this. Anyway, they speak Dutch or Flemish in the north, and in the south they speak a French language, or in Wallonia, and these people are called the Walloons. It really sharply divides the country. In fact, they don't get along very well at all. And a lot of people have suggested that Belgium may at some point break up because of it. Okay, and then, all right, so now we're going to shift over to religion. So religion, one of the things I want to talk about versus, so when people migrate, most people take on the language of their new home. Now, some people, people take their language to their new home, but usually within at least a generation, they learn the language. Now, it depends on at what age you come. It was interesting over winter break. I have some cousins who married. I have a cousin who married a Venezuelan, and so that whole side of the family was here. And so the kids who came over, so there was a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they've been here for like a couple of years or maybe less than a year. And they didn't speak any English before they came, but now they speak almost perfect English. So a 10 and a 13-year-old, almost perfect English. You couldn't, they seemed as American as can be. His parents, who are in their 60s, who have been here for like 10 years, they can barely have a conversation in English. So that just kind of goes to show you how quickly those things change. But what's interesting is when people migrate, most people do not take on the religion of their new home. So whereas, people learn the language of their new home, they don't take on the religion. Now, there's a couple reasons. Language, first of all, people can practice multiple languages and not practice multiple religions. And also, as we discussed, most people don't give up their religion. Religion is part of, a very core belief. And so people aren't just going to be like willy-nilly giving up their religion. So anyway, let's transition to religion. So back to, you do have an FRQ, sorry, not an FRQ, but on page 49 and to 50, 51, and then on 52, you have another place where where language divides people. And we talked about that in Cameroon. So make sure to do that. And then when we jump ahead to page 53, we see, this is the part that we didn't do, the part about page 53 and page 54, that we didn't spend much time with. The one thing I would say on page 55, I forgot to put a slide in about this, but it's definitely very important, this idea of Hebrew and what happened when Israel was created in 1947. There was a need to create have a universal language for all the people of Israel. And since people came from all over the world, they used Hebrew as kind of a unifying language, the ancient language of the Jewish people. So make sure to note that. Then on page 57, we have the KBAT for religion. Then, of course, starting on page 58, 59, 60, 61, et cetera, into page 65, we have the textbook reading for religion. And then we've got on page 67, we talked a little bit about the Christian family tree. Well, actually, I did these out of order. We're going to come back to that in a second, but I'm going to jump ahead to page, sorry, I did it this way. We're here on page 79. So here's a pie chart just to give you, what are the major world religions? Well, just to give you a sense, the biggest one is Christianity. About a third of the world is Christian. About a quarter of the world is Muslim. 15% Hindu, and then about 7% Buddhist. So those are all the major world religions whenever we talked about, and we always include Judaism as a major world religion, not because it's big, but because of the kind of cultural and all sorts of other impacts it's had. It is the basis for both Christianity and Islam. So it usually gets included. So let's just keep going through here and see what I've got. Can't really remember. So if we keep going, so one of the things, so turn to page, let's see, I'm sorry, I don't know where, oh yeah, we're still on page 79. So one of the things that we want to make sure we understand, and we're going to look at this map on page 80 in a second, is this idea, and this is huge important. So this will definitely be like an FRQ question. So the difference between a universalizing religion and a ethnic religion. So universalizing religions appeal to everybody, meaning they want everybody to become their religion. You know, Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and some other ones, Baha'i does this. They want everybody to become their religion. Now, some in the past, hundreds of years ago, they did it by force. You know, you literally convert people at the point of a sword. But now, of course, it's more subtle, and it's done by things like missionaries and other ways like that. So that's universalizing religion. And ethnic religion, of course, only appeals to one group. So, of course, Jews and Hindus are primary. Hindus are almost all Indian, and Jews, people who practice Judaism, are entirely Jewish for the most part. You can convert to Judaism. You could theoretically become a Hindu, but you know, that's just not how it usually works. And so if you look at this map, we can very easily see, okay, and imagine an FRQ about this. Why is Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism in so many different countries, whereas, you know, things like Judaism, which is here, and Hinduism, which is here, why does that? It's because Hinduism and Judaism are ethnic religions, meaning they haven't tried to spread all around the world, whereas the universalizing religions have. And so that kind of explains that. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between universalizing and ethnic religions. Okay, those are really important. Okay, so if we actually back up a little bit, I know I did this a little bit out of order, and we go to, and I'm going to try to just pick up the pace here a little bit. We go to page 67. We talk about the major branches of Christianity. Of course, it starts at about 0 based on the Christian calendar with Jesus. Then you have the Great Schism, and you have the split between Catholicism, which was in Rome, and of course, Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox Christianity, which eventually goes to Constantinople. That happens in about 1066. And so you've got, the split with Christianity, Eastern Church. Oh, sorry, 1066 is when the, get my 11th century dates confused. 1066 is when the Normans invaded England, but 1054 is when there was the split between the Eastern and Western Church. And of course, the Protestant Reformation was more recent in 1519, where you get the Protestant religions like Lutheranism and Anglicanism and Methodist and etc. And they, so those are mostly, and if we should, I'm going to show you a picture here. So you get, and this is a really important map, which is on page 68. You will definitely see this map on, I believe, in the, I say definitely, and then I said, I corrected myself. I'm just looking at the test right now. Want to make sure that, no, I guess this particular map, well, it maybe is in some versions, but anyway, this is really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows the different branches of Christianity in Europe. Of course, the Northern Europeans tended to be Protestants, the Southern Europeans tended to be Catholics, and then the Eastern Europeans tend to be Eastern Orthodox, okay? And then the other key thing here is this idea of an intra and inter-faith boundary. So I'll start with intra. Intra-faith boundaries are between boundary between two branches of the same religion. So if we look here in Germany, there's lots of intra-faith boundaries where the Protestants and the Catholics meet. And the reason we care about these boundaries is because they are where conflict has happened in the past. So you see these different intra-faith boundaries. Then there's also what we call inter-faith boundaries. And of course, an inter-faith boundary is going to be, inter-faith boundaries are going to be primarily in places where, like here is an inter-faith boundary between Islam and Christianity, okay? So you definitely need to know the difference between intra and inter-faith boundaries. And again, the reason to focus on these is because they are often places where conflict arises. Okay. All right, let's move on. So a little bit about Christianity diffusion. Most Christians go to, it's happened through relocation diffusion, through the Roman Empire, missionaries, colonization. So, and also through hierarchical diffusion, because, especially leaders would change their religion, or especially the emperor of Rome became Christian in 313. And so basically all the Romans became Christian. So that's hierarchical diffusion. And then of course, once colonists got to places like Africa and Australia and the Americas, then they spread their religion through contagious diffusion, like just word of mouth, person to person. Okay. Of course, that's around the, okay. And then Christian migration today, of course, most Christians, this is the number of migrants in the world today. And the majority of people around the world who have migrated are actually Christian, almost half of the migrants, a good number of Muslims as well. And of course, many, many Jews, because those people have moved in many cases to Israel. So Christians move, most Christians move to other Christian countries. You get a lot of people from Latin America moving into the United States. You've got Europeans moving into other European countries. So yeah, Islam, let's talk about Islam. So again, it's an Abrahamic religion. You definitely need to know the name Abraham, okay? Abraham was the founding father of Judaism. He is considered to be the founder of, he made the covenant with Jesus, or sorry, not with Jesus, with God, and they made this agreement that the Hebrews or the Jewish people would follow him. Then when Jesus came along, he continued that relationship with this God, same God, the God of Abraham. So, and then same thing with Muhammad. When Muhammad founded Islam, he continued that same tradition of following the Abrahamic faith. And so they all worship the same God. So that's Abraham, okay? So of course, 6th century AD, Muhammad, and he got the Quran, he was revealed to him. And of course, it's in Arabic as a lingua franca. Then he spread it throughout much of Saudi Arabia. Here, of course, is Medina, where he's from. And then much into the different Arab countries. Well, the Arab countries over here, they become Arab countries, I should say, because the Arabs who were led by Muhammad spread it throughout much of the Middle East. Now, of course, most of these people aren't Arabs, only here in North Africa and in the Arab Peninsula, and also up here in Iraq. But anyway, Muslim branches, there's two main branches, the Sunni branch and the Shiite branch. I'm not going to go over them because they're in your notes, but you should know the major Muslim countries that are Shiite are Iran and Iraq, and to a lesser extent, Azerbaijan. So you should know those. And of course, you should know this is, what is this? This is a intra-faith boundary where and of course, this comes into play in Iraq quite a bit, where the Shiites and the Sunnis meet, okay? Intra-faith boundary. Okay, a little bit more. What am I doing? Here we go. Okay, so Muslim migration, a lot of migration is from, we've talked about South Asia, like India, where there are a lot of Muslims, in Pakistan, and into the Gulf countries, right? Into the oil-rich Gulf countries. A lot of people also moving from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. And we've talked about some of the hostility that they're facing in Europe. Buddhism. So not much to mention here in terms of geography, but of course it's from northern India, which is really important. That's where the Buddha lived. He was a Hindu prince, and he became enlightened, and he just started this religion called Buddhism, named after him. And yeah, he went throughout northern India, and then of course he died. And Buddhism spread throughout East Asia, Southeast Asia. It got up here into Central Asia, but now it's been taken over by Islam, of course, came much later. So anyway, that's Buddhism. Hinduism, we don't really know where Hinduism came from, but we think it came from this kind of blending of these people who came, these people who were speaking the Indo-European language. They came here, and so they're often referred to by like anthropologists and archaeologists as Aryans. And they came here into northern India, and this blending of cultures kind of created Hinduism. So multiple gods, polytheistic religion, right? And they also created the caste system. So other ethnic religions, a couple of other things. So in China, we have Confucianism and Taoism. So these are ethnic religions, meaning mostly just Chinese people follow them. So there's this idea of syncretism. So, especially in places like China and maybe a couple other places in East Asia, you might practice Buddhism and Confucianism, or Taoism and Buddhism, and have a blending of those. And syncretism is this idea of combining multiple religious traditions. And so you see this in East Asia with Buddhism and Taoism, but you also see it in like the Caribbean, where you'd have African people, following their traditional African beliefs, but then blending it with Catholicism. And you can see that in religions like Rastafarianism or Santeria more closely. So those are examples of syncretism, and we'll talk more about those smaller religions that you were supposed to read about. Okay, so I haven't been keeping track of where we are in the booklet. Sorry, I'm on page 73 now. We're talking about African folk religions like animism. We can see 100 years ago, a lot of people were animistic and followed these folk traditions, believing in, powers of the supernatural in the natural world, like mountains and rivers and animals. But now that's pretty much gone, because at least in North Africa, the influence of Islam is kind of taken away a lot of folk cultural traditions, but same with Christianity in the South. Then we had Judaism. So Judaism, as we've talked about, is both an ethnicity and a religion. So it's not, again, most people don't convert to Judaism. So it's from Israel. Of course, the diaspora spread, which means scattering of people, which we talked about in the migration unit, happened when the Romans forced them out. Of course, at that point, the second Jewish temple was destroyed, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But most of the time, Jews lived in Europe in ghettos, but also in other places in the Middle East and North Africa. And these were ethnic enclaves. Sometimes they were forced to live there. Sometimes it was more voluntary. But the Holocaust, obviously, was this horrific event in Europe in 1940s. 30s and 40s, where the majority of European Jews were killed. So then, of course, Jews don't live in Europe for the most part anymore, and they live primarily in Israel. And so we can see on page 74, you can see in about 100 years ago, most of the Jews lived in Russia, actually a majority, and other European countries, Germany, Hungary, Austria, these places in Europe. Now, very few live in Europe. And most live in Israel or the United States. Okay, now page 75 and 76, and then on to page 77, not 78, because that was a bad crossword puzzle that I made. But you need to read about the smaller world religions. There will definitely be some questions about the smaller world religions, certainly on the FRQ section, but and a couple on the multiple choice as well. So that's on pages 75 through 77. Okay. Now we're going to talk about, let's jump ahead. And I did not put slides for pages on page 81 for the different religious groups in the United States, but you need to know those. I just tried to save time. So you need to know the basics of like where the Mormons are, primarily around Utah, right? Where are Catholics down along the US-Mexican border, but also up in the Northeast, the Italians and the Puerto Rican Catholics. Where are the Baptists down in the South? So have a good sense. Where do most Jews live? Mostly in the cities. So have a good sense of where the religious groups are on page 81 in the booklet. Okay. So now we're going to go through really quickly. Christian churches were often the tallest buildings in town in Europe. And of course, the Catholics and the Orthodox churches were ornate. So they look like this, a lot of gold and golden chandeliers and all sorts of stuff. The Protestant churches are more austere, more plain, going along with kind of their traditions. Tallest one. Here are some churches in Europe that are the tallest in the town. This is a Orthodox church, because you can tell from what's called an onion dome, classic onion dome. You also have the Muslim mosque, which are community centers. Some kind of physical features you note are these minarets. And one of the purposes is for this person to call to prayer. But especially in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, you'll see these large minarets outside the mosques. And of course, this is was a church in Istanbul. Then it became a mosque. Now it's a museum. Okay. Sikh Gurdwaras is the most famous one in a place called in Punjab, Amritsar, famous Golden Temple of Amritsar. Their holiest book is actually housed there. Sikh Gurdwara, Jewish synagogue, a place of worship, but also a place where people go to learn the Torah, but also other Jewish texts. Baha'i, the most notable thing about the Baha'i temple is their nonagons. They're nine-sided. Let's get through this. Buddhist pagoda. Now, Buddhists have temples where they do, they might do their traditional worship, but in terms of the cultural landscape, you might see these in particularly East Asia. Over here is these wooden ones that have kind of more of a sloping, broad roof. And then in Southeast Asia, you're going to have something more like this. Like Cambodia, Thailand, places like that. And of course, what's housed here are relics of the Buddha. So pieces of his clothing, pieces of his body, etc. So you'll see that in the cultural landscape. You also have Hindu temples, which is not where people go for like a weekly worship, but for to go for different gods and whatnot. Weekly worship happens primarily in the home for Hindus. Then, of course, with the Mormon Church or LDS, we have they have churches, but they also have which are for weekly meetings and things like that. But they also have temples, which is where they have the sacred rituals like marriage, temple marriage, and baptisms for the dead and things like that. So churches very common, temples really rare. They don't have them as much. Then we talked a little bit about the idea of utopian settlement. So this is like an ideal society built around religion. The most well-known one was the Mormons, who started here in New York, and then they eventually made it into Illinois and then Missouri, and then they made it out here to Utah, which was actually Mexico at the time. And they tried to have this utopian settlement, and eventually Mormons evolved into just being part of the not isolated in a settlement. Utopian settlement, but they became part of the American culture. You also have hierarchical religions, which is where you have this geographical structure, which is where you have at least with the Mormons, you have the prophet or the president on top, and then you have different organizations based on geography. And so you have the same thing with the Catholic Church, Pope on top, and then you've got archbishops and bishops, and they all have this kind of strict geographical hierarchy. Okay. And then you also have autonomous religions, which are not hierarchical like that. So they're just locally run. So they don't have somebody at the top, and they don't have these geographic restrictions. You can go to any church you want to go to. You just go to the church that you pick. Could be across town, it could be next door, or who knows. So those are autonomous religions. Last thing here, just briefly, I want to talk about disposing of the dead. We talked about Christians, Muslims, and Jews bury their dead. Traditionally, of course, things have changed more recently, and Hindus cremate. So, in terms of the cultural landscape, one of the things you're not going to see a lot of in India are cemeteries. And if you do find cemeteries, who's going to be buried there? The Muslim people. Okay. Of course, Zoroastrians expose their dead to scavengers. And here's people burning they're cremating their dead here along the Ganges River in India. Okay, a couple things. Pilgrimage. You need to know this idea of pilgrimage, a journey to a sacred place for a religious purpose. Of course, the pilgrimage site that we talked most about is Mecca. Of course, that's related to this idea of the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. It's one of the 5 pillars. And we can see, but in addition to that, there are also other religious sites. There's dozens, hundreds of religious sites around the world. I asked you guys to do on page 86 and 87 to read about there's a website, and it's posted on Google Classroom for the ancient sacred religious sites, to learn a little bit about some of those other sites. And that will definitely be a question for the FRQs. Okay. All right. So if we continue on, And again, that example. And then you also have an extra credit assignment on page 89 to 91 if you wanted to do that. And then we're here in the challenges of religion. We're almost done. So I talked a little bit about the religion of the Middle East. Of course, we know Jews came from, well, Abraham brought the Jewish people out of what is today Iraq. Ur is where Abraham is said to have been from, and he brought his people here into Canaan. God said this was their promised land. They went to Egypt for a while, then were freed, came back to what is become known as Israel by the Jewish people. But of course, Christians also consider lots of places in Jerusalem, especially, to be holy because that's where Jesus lived. And then Muslims believe Jerusalem is the third holiest site in all of Islam. And then also, so here, we see Islam throughout what is today Israel. So what we're really focused on, I really wanted to focus a little bit on this area. And so we, of course, see that you have the Arabs coming in, especially when Jews were kicked out by the Romans. And then you have also the Christians with the Crusades said, well, we're going to take some of this land back. And they did that in the 11th, 12th, and even into the 13th centuries. And then, of course, there was the empire of the Ottoman Empire, which came and takes back or establishes and they're part of their empire in Palestine, this area. And of course, then we know that the Jewish people start to move to, and we kind of go over this on pages 94 and 95. I'm not going to go through this in detail because I'm trying to save time, but essentially what happens is a lot of Jews move into this area, Palestine, Israel area. And, after World War II, there was quite a bit more sympathy towards Jewish people than there had been. Of course, a lot of people have been anti-Semitic for forever. But there was somewhat more sympathy after the Holocaust. And so the UN, because Jewish people had bought up a lot of land and had moved into Palestine, Israel area. And so the United Nations is given the task of trying to split this up. And so they create this partition plan, and they gave the green areas to the Arabs and the yellow areas to the Jewish people. And that started in 1947. But then less than a year later, there was a war. Israel declares independence. Israel claims all of the yellow territory you can see here, and also West Jerusalem. And the Palestinians, who are the Arabs in this area, get what is today called the West Bank, or at least part of it. And then in the 1967 war, the Israelis claim all of the Palestinian land. So the West Bank and Gaza. So these are two places you definitely need to know about: Gaza Strip and the West Bank here. And kind of importantly, what happened is the Jewish people have moved in to the West Bank and have built the blue here are the settlements that the Israeli people have built. And this is occupied territory. The West Bank and Gaza is called the occupied territory. So these are areas that are essentially some places are kind of shared between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but the Israelis have essential control over these areas where the Palestinians live. So the current conflict is the Israelis are like, hey, listen, we fought these wars with our neighbors. We've won most of them, but it's still like an existential threat. The Palestinians shoot rockets at us. We have this historical and legal right, and we want the settlements to stay in the West Bank. And then we want Jerusalem. But the Palestinians say the Jews took their land and they want to go back to the 1967 line. So they essentially want to go back to the time before. I'm going to back up here. They want to go back to like here, essentially, before the Israelis took the West Bank and Gaza. So they want that back. They want all of the West Bank and they want all of Gaza instead of having these settlements. They say the settlements have to go. They're illegal, and they want Jerusalem to be their capital as well. Okay. So again, we're almost done here, folks. A couple of things. Jerusalem is really important because it's the center of conflict, and you guys have this all in your notes, but this is really key. There will definitely be questions about this. What is going on in Jerusalem that is so important? Of course, you've got the Church of the Holy Sepulchre right here, very important to Christians as the site of Jesus's crucifixion. You've got what's down here, the Dome of the Rock, which is believed to be where Muhammad ascended to heaven. Muslims also believe it is where I believe Muslims also believe it's where the Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, although now I'm second guessing myself on that. Either way, Muslims believe it's the third holiest site in Islam because it is where Muhammad ascended to heaven. And then, of course, this right here, the Western Wall, is the holiest site in all of Islam, or sorry, all of Judaism, because it's the last remaining part of the second Jewish temple that was destroyed by the Romans. And it's basically all they've got of their, well, not entirely, but it's one of the most important, well, it is the most important place for all of Islam. So anyway, in this very small area. So that's why Jerusalem is so important. Okay. Oh, here we can see actually, here's the Dome of the Rock. Here's the Western Wall. And you can't see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on this slide, but it's somewhere kind of over here. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of where are we still, and so let's look back on page, so now we're on page 98. So a little bit about where religion and is a kind of, it's not the source of conflict. It's not like people hate each other necessarily because they believe different things. It's all about power. It's all about access to land and resources and politics. But there's a couple places we studied. One, Nigeria. Okay, so Nigeria is northern Nigeria is Muslim, southern Nigeria is Christian, and there's a lot of conflict, and it's all political, right? If you vote, when you vote, it's nominally a democracy, and so when people vote for their politicians, they usually vote along religious lines. And so one of the big issues is this idea of Sharia law, Islamic religious law. So Christians don't want to follow Sharia law, but in northern Nigeria, they passed laws that say we're going to use Sharia law, but the southern Nigerians don't want, and especially, and there are Christians scattered throughout, as there are Muslims scattered throughout. So they just want, they don't want to be controlled by those laws. And the northerners don't want necessarily kind of the Christians westernization in their area. Northern Ireland, up here is part of the United Kingdom. Of course, the rest of Ireland, the island called Ireland is the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is almost entirely Catholic. Northern Ireland has a lot of Catholics, but it also has a lot of Protestants. And so what you've got is you've got this, especially in and around Belfast, you've got this mixing of Protestants and Catholics. And there, for a long time in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, there was this period called the Troubles, where there was basically paramilitary organizations killing each other, and all this is described in the in articles on page starting on page 101. But even in neighborhoods, they don't get along still to this day. They don't even interact with each other. And they've built these big walls throughout Belfast, which is the capital of Northern Ireland, to kind of separate the different religions. The last place we want to talk about is Iraq. Most of northern Iraq is divided between southern Shiites, and in the west is mostly Sunni Arabs, and then in the north is actually they're Kurdish people, and we'll talk a lot more about Kurds next unit. But the big focus here is this intra-faith boundary between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and there's a lot of conflict and we know that one of the big things recently is this idea that the Sunni people have been persecuted by the Shiite majority. And so, unfortunately, one of the places they've found to turn to is like terror groups like ISIS, because they, say, listen, we'll protect you from the Shiites. And the Shiites and the Sunnis do not get along very well. And again, it's mostly political, again, in those places. So, and that, again, here's where ISIS had their control in different places in northern Iraq and Syria. Of course, that's a civil war going on there. And that is all I've got. So I'm just trying to think of, sorry, I'm fumbling around here. So yeah, so hopefully that was, I don't really know how long that took. I think way too long, but yeah, so those are the highlights. And again, just to remind you, in addition to the things I mentioned, you also need to do the the FRQ practice in the back on pages 107 through 111. And then, of course, you've got your focus country to do on pages 13 through 14. So my hope is that you've done all those things, and you're just going to need to do a little bit of final review. And I hope this video was helpful. But yeah, if not, you know, so be it. You just wasted a little out. No, hopefully it was good. Anyway, I'm really excited to get back to school. And see you guys all, and hope you guys have had a great break. And I am going to stop now because why keep talking? All right, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you very soon. If you have any questions, please email me or come in and talk to me tomorrow if you're if you have any questions. All right, take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.